Hello, I'm Bruce,
I'm Aditya.
and we are the Risky Scientists. And this is our Risky Wrinkle of the week. This is where we try to iron out some issue of risk that has been in the news this week, which is confusing. So, Aditya, what are we doing this week for Risky Wrinkle?
Yeah, Bruce. So today I want to talk about the different terms that are being used now to describe mortality rate. So you're hearing all of these different terms that are thrown about, and especially when people are trying to compare COVID to the flu or to other potential health risks, I think it's important to clear up the terms. So I'm hearing things along the lines of three main terms that come to mind. The first is what is called the CFR, or the case fatality rate. The second is the infection fatality rate, and the IFR, that is, and the last one is the PFR, so the population fatality rate. And I think it's important to separate these things because we get data primarily on the CFR, the case fatality rate, because we know the number of cases and we usually know the number of total deaths. And so the case fatality rate, we should probably define these things, is the number of deaths per number of confirmed cases.
We should just clarify that for a rate in general is just one number in terms of another, at simplest. Or so one measure as a proportion of another is probably the best definition of rate. You can correct me if you've got a better definition, but
Absolutely. I think it's one number over another. I would think of that as a ratio. And that ratio we normally talk about actually in terms of percentages. So we talk about case fatality rate as what percentage of cases lead to deaths. And I mean, I think we're seeing some fluctuation in different countries, but we're probably seeing a case fatality rate on the order of between right now, based on what we know, between 1 and 5% or 1 and 10% or something like that. But in comparison with the case fatality rate, we might also be interested in the infection fatality rate. So the infection fatality rate is, we don't really know all of the positive cases of COVID, right? I mean, I think it's very clear that we're missing some cases in our testing. Exactly what fraction of cases we're missing is perhaps unknown, but we are missing cases. And the infection fatality rate is the total number of deaths over the true number of positive COVID infections.
yeah, which is often an estimate.
Which is often an estimate, exactly. And usually what we are interested in is the IFR. I mean, that's what we really want to know, right? I really want to know what is the real probability that if I get COVID, I'm going to have a bad outcome. But it's something that we usually can't measure. In fact, unless you test everybody and you have perfect tests, you really can't measure it. So we have to use other metrics and proxies to get a sense for what the IFR is. The PFR is also something that people are using now, and I think it's an important one to point out, which is the population fatality rate. So this is just the total number of deaths divided by the total number of people. So it doesn't really care about the number of infections. It's just saying what percentage of your entire population is dying from COVID. And this is important because if you look at something like New York, I think the latest numbers are that the total number of COVID deaths is about 1,000, a little bit more than 1,000 per million people in New York. And so that's a measure of the population fatality rate, whereas the number of deaths per confirmed cases is significantly higher as a rate because there are much fewer confirmed cases than people in New York.
Yeah, we should point out that there's now a measurement wrinkle here because you've just expressed it as essentially parts per million, which is a conventional way of measuring human risks, medical risks, but human risks in general. So if there was a natural disaster, we would also measure deaths per million because that's just a conventional way of doing it. But we can also, as you expressed earlier, we can also express that as a percentage. So that can be confusing too, where and you also see sometimes rates per thousand.
Yeah.
So it can be confusing when you're seeing these different rates, and you sometimes have to pay attention to what is the denominator
Yeah.
rate.
Absolutely. And I think all these terms are also kind of confusing, even for me. Sometimes I'm like, wait, I have to go back and look at the math and say, well, what are we actually calculating? But I like this little analogy, and it's kind of related to what I've been seeing in the news, and it helps me remember. So maybe I'll share it with you and share it with our listeners, which is that now we've been seeing a lot of reports of people driving over 100 miles an hour because the roads have been relatively clear and things like that over the past couple of weeks. And so if I want to know, basically, what fraction of speeders are driving over 100 miles an hour, right? That's probably not a good thing unless you're in a very safe location. So if you're driving over 100 miles an hour, I can say, well, what fraction of all drivers on the road right now are driving over 100 miles an hour, right? Or even better, I can say, what fraction of all people with driver's licenses are driving over 100 miles an hour? So that's kind of my population fatality rate equivalent. My infection fatality rate might be what percentage of everybody who's driving over the speed limit is driving over 100 miles an hour. And so there's a lot of people driving over the speed limit, but many of them may not be driving over 100 miles an hour, right? So they may have mild cases. And finally, the case fatality rate is what percentage of all speeding tickets given out. So this, now you've been caught going too quickly. And what percentage of all speeding tickets are over 100 mile an hour speeding tickets? And so that kind of helps me make sense of these jargons and these terms in a way that is maybe a little bit more accessible to things we do in our everyday life.
Yeah. We should note the controversies about these different rates because they can be spun.
Yeah.
It's one of the problems with having different rates. So if you give the case fatality rate, well, that somebody can come along and say, well, that overestimates the lethality of the virus.
Yeah.
And therefore, COVID-19 is not as dangerous as you are pretending. And you may not be spinning anything if you're using the case fatality rate. You're just saying, of the confirmed cases of COVID-19, this is the rate of death in that particular subpopulation. And that is useful for comparing other diseases by their case fatality rate. Mm-hmm. But somebody can inevitably come along and say, well, you're using the case fatality rate because you're spinning the lethality. You are trying to overestimate the lethality because you don't know what the infection fatality rate, which is going to look lower, because now we're looking at the lethality per a larger population. So the lethality is going to look lower. But as a statistician, we can compare those rates across different diseases, and that is perfectly fair. But it is true that people can use the different types of rate to spin agendas. Now that's a problem when you've got multiple measures available.
Absolutely. I think another way of saying that is that these different metrics give you, in my mind, upper bounds and lower bounds for what the true lethality rate is. So the population fatality rate, in my mind, is kind of the lowest the fatality rate could be, because you're probably have a very large proportion in your denominator of people who aren't even COVID positive. And generally, I think as long as you're doing a good job of counting the deaths, the case fatality rate is probably your upper bound. So as a statistician, I think of these two things, kind of my lower bound and my upper bound. But at the same time, I think I want to go back to something you said earlier to try and clear this up, which is in our very first episode, you talked about comparisons. And I think we have to be very clear when making comparisons. So yes, you can use these different things to kind of put different spins on it. So if I look at the current closed case fatality rate on worldometers, it's 18%, and you should be very worried. I think the true infection fatality rate is probably a little bit lower than 18%. But if I wanted to make it seem scary,
a lot lower, just we don't want to alarm people. So a lot lower, it's probably less than 1%.
It's probably exactly right. So it's a lot lower than 18%, but that's the highest number. I don't think there's any possibility of it being 19%, right? In terms of thinking probabilistically. And similarly, the population fatality rate, people are saying, oh, it's only 0.01%. Well, I've read studies now that say 0.2% of the entire Italian population, or same in New York, have passed away. So it's clearly more than 0.1 or 0.2% as well. And I think that is maybe a way for us to think about this in terms of bounds, and then think about it in terms of comparisons. So you have to compare metric to metric. So if you want to compare flu versus COVID, you have to compare the case fatality rates. You can't compare the true fatality rate for one with the case fatality rate for the other, because you're going to get a bias.
We should clarify, it doesn't matter which rate you use against influenza. COVID-19 is deadlier than influenza.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. Huh. Well, maybe that clears it up.
I think so. Well done, sir.
Thank you. All right. Well, we'll be back next week with a new risky wrinkle. As always, send us your thoughts and comments on what you would like us to discuss on these.